Chapter 5. With narrowed lids, Pat watched Ches Denton out of sight. He sat down then in the chair the other had vacated, staring into space while he considered this whole matter with stern practicality. Denton's cool assumption that Ezra had unquestionably and with malice aforethought pumped a slug into Chuck Grangner, drunk as he was, had warned him against so much as bothering to open the subject. Convinced now that Ches had a hand in the affair, Pat knew he would well be on guard against any damaging admissions. As for how much deeper the man was actually involved, Pat remained undecided. But there was this much about it, that someone in charge of Dell Follonsbees' persecution had obviously, on the ground even now, maintained a close surveillance over her actions, and, who could be handier, with a more reasonable excuse for his presence than the cattle buyer? The circumstantial probability of guilt, if not for solid rock for proof, was slowly closing in on Denton. Pat was soberly canvassing the poor possibilities of bringing the other man to book on the basis of what he knew, when a crisp tap of heels coming from the direction of the hotel entrance brought his head swinging around. Next moment he was out of his chair, hat in hand, grinning a cheerful greeting for the girl so recently in his thoughts. "Howdy, Dell. Somehow I didn't expect to find you in here," he opened up casually. "Nice enough to see you any time, of course. I don't want to seem like I'm complaining." She gave him a forlorn smile.
"How are you, Pat? I've had invitations enough, goodness knows, and I might have accepted them all if I could be in 5 places all at once. Somehow I shrink from the idea of all of Father's friends feeling sorry for me. I did let Bobby go to stay with the Hafners for a day or two. Poor boy, he's had a rather hard time of it lately, and I have a thing or two I wanted to take care of myself."
There was no word of her own troubles, Pat noted, nor any hint of repining, as she sank down in the chair, which he turned invitingly, while he took the next. Knowing her obscure need for unburden herself, however indirectly, he let her talk on, paying only partial heed to her words, and meanwhile scrutinizing thoughtfully her clean-cut and courageous young face. Suddenly aware that she had stopped and was looking at him expectantly, he met her eyes squarely. "What are they doing to you, Dell?" he demanded gravely. Abrupt as the change of subject was, she followed his thoughts without difficulty.
"Attempting to scare me into silence is what I imagine," she returned promptly.
Her tone advised her contemptuous fearlessness of anything worse, nor did Pat miss the clear implication that she must already have talked, and would go on talking, boldly and uncompromisingly in certain quarters. "You know," he said slowly, "I've heard some of these stories in circulation about Bart's failure. Mighty close to slanderous, to say the least, and I needn't add how little of it I believe. What's the real story, Dell?" he broke off shortly. She stared at him, wet her lips.
"You mean, how did Dad come to lose the ranch?"
"That's what I mean," he nodded.
"You already know, Pat, full as well as I do myself," accused Della softly.
Again Pat nodded. "I thought so. A slick piece of manipulation as I read it, with old Bart too stubborn, cussed and independent to call in help before it was too late." He looked at her with poorly concealed pity. "Probably he never even told you exactly how they worked it on him."
"No, he didn't," her voice caught. "I believe that right to the last he planned to recover his property. He was unconquerable, Pat, or believed he was. Surely there was a day when it was true, but nature betrayed him, and his explosive temper no doubt played a part."
"And you think this Vern Hunter may have something be useful for you?" Pat hastily shunted off her other thoughts. Della fought her way back to equanimity, gazing sightlessly into the room. Her small back straightened unconsciously as she once more addressed herself to present problems.
Mr. Larkin, that was Dad's foreman, has undoubtedly gone over to the present owners,
she admitted, brows knitting.
It's useless to ask Squint for information. I've tried.
But you'd trust Hunter to talk?
He's the only other man I can think of to having dealings with Father there at the last, and I gotta trust someone,
she said simply, her rueful tone and the direction of her argument revealing all too fully the weakness of her position. Just who are the present owners? You must have seen their names on some papers or something. She shrugged helplessly.
Apparently they're a small syndicate or partnership of some kind, Pat. I've seen scrawling on legal documents, of course, and I understand I was too wretched at the time to have them spelled out to me.
It was so typically feminine an answer that Pat passed over this in silence. He thought it all over unhurriedly. Have you taken your troubles to a lawyer? He asked at length. The girl admitted that she hadn't. Self-reliant all his life, her wary old father's last decisive act had been to advise her strongly against such a move. Della confessed, moreover, that a bolder attorney involved in the foreclosure proceedings had laughed at her protests. Such things had succeeded in dampening her hopes, if not her resolve. I can see how it came about. Pat shook his head. It was a mistake all the same. I don't want to know anything about this case myself. He surprised her by saying, There's nothing in this I'm trained to deal with, but if you'll follow my advice, ma'am, you'll get yourself to a lawyer right away and without any further delay.
But I don't, she began.
There's a young local attorney. He's a friend of mine. He brushed over her feeble demur firmly. The name's Henry Mayer, a shrewd boy and square as the day's long. Why not talk to Henry at least? He looked across expectantly. Don't worry, there won't be any expense involved, unless he gets results, but at least he'll be able to tell you where you stand.
That's very kind of you, Pat. Are you sure? She asked uncomfortably.
Come along. He got up, intent on hurrying her into the right direction before her wavering intentions weakened. I'll take you down there now. Henry's got a keen as eye for a pretty girl as I have. You'll have your troubles off your mind in no time. Laughing uncertainly, Della signified her willingness to accompany him. In strolling down the boardwalk, Pat was keenly conscious of moving beside the most warmly attractive girl he had beheld in many a month. Don't worry about confiding fully in Henry Mayer, he cautioned as they paused before the steps leading up to the attorney's office. You tell him everything you can think of, and leave it to him to draw his own conclusions.
I'll certainly do that, she promised. And I ought to be thoroughly obliged to you, Pat, for setting me on the right track.
Okay. Let's just wait for more practical results. He brushed aside her gratitude. Henry Mayer was in his office, and ready to listen to anything that Della might have to tell him. He was a slim, blond young fellow, with clever hands and a quiet manner. After introducing them, and admonishing Meyer to take good care of the girl, Pat withdrew to slump back to the stairs, and conscious of having performed a good deed as far as Della's problems were concerned. A cursory glance about town failed to reveal Sam Salone's whereabouts. So deeply troubled was the squat man over his partner's situation that there was no telling exactly what form his frantic solitude might have assumed. Well, I hope he ain't fool enough to try hunting Ezra up, thought Pat. Just Lawler would ask no better chance to grab that lanky galoot. Retiring to the Gold Eagle to wait, He joined a small group of friends in a hand of poker, and was not greatly surprised an hour later to look up and find Sam sliding into a chair across the table. A glance passed between them, but nothing was said until after the game broke up and they bellied up to the bar side by side. "Well," Pat murmured, his lips barely moving. "There's no sign of Ez, but I seen Dell come out of the lawyer's office and get back to the hotel okay," muttered Sam. "That Huffy Denton Jasper was watching her like a hawk, but he didn't make no move." "Good for you." Pat nodded his approval. "Chess'll be in for a surprise if he tangles with Henry Mayer." They lingered there in the bar, although it was nearing supper time, the reddening sun slanting in through the half doors and striking ruby sparks off the bottles and glasses that were resting on the back bar. Still brooding over Ezra's enforced flight, Salome professed no particular appetite for food. Thus it happened that they were still in the place when a hubbub broke out in the street. In the muffled crash, a gunfire pounded the air from somewhere in the distance. Gunshots were no great novelty in Dutch Springs, punchers often venting their exuberance in that manner. Yet, so sensitive were men to the sinister infections of such explosions that rumor of a fight often washed through town almost as quickly as the sounds themselves, as it was now. "Listen," Sam exclaimed, stiffening as he cocked an ear. "Hear that yelling? There's a row going on somewheres. Come on, Pat. They may have grabbed Ez." He started out of the place on a run. Pat was only a step behind him as they reached the opening. Men could be seen hurrying, and a group had gathered before the entrance of the Wagon Wheel restaurant, a few doors from the Dutch Spring Bank. They hastened down there, and Salone's bristly face already having assumed its usual placidity once more. "It can't be Ezra anyhow," he puffed. "He wouldn't never get himself caught in a public place like that." But the news which greeted them when they got down there proved almost as bad, from Pat's point of view at least. Just as they came up, the crowd parted, and Sheriff Lawler appeared in the door, dragging two disheveled punchers out of the restaurant with him. "All right, boys. A little room, please." Jess was curt and authoritative, and shouldered his way through. The onlookers fell back, and Pat had had time for a sharp scrutiny of the two captives as they were hauled past. They were both middle-aged, and fully as reckless-looking as the majority of their breed. He had never clapped eyes upon either of them. Men followed the trio towards the jail, but others remained behind, talking together in low tones. "What happened, Abe?" Stevens asked an acquaintance. "Well, there was a shooting rowing down there in the restaurant," was the response. "The boys got a little load on, I reckon. They started to scuffle over nothing, and one thing led to another. They made plenty of smoke, and a flying slug hit a man in there, which makes it kind of bad. I hear he's in pretty tough shape." Pat's eyes slitted swiftly at this. "Who was it?" he queried tonelessly. "Hank Mayer, the lawyer," replied his informant, not at all to Pat's surprise. "He was eating all alone at a table, and danged if a slug didn't catch him square in the brisket. Pretty rotten luck, eh?" Without another word, Pat forced his way into the restaurant. The place had been cleared, and 2 or 3 men were working over young Mayer, to no avail, it appeared. Even as Pat entered, one of them got up from his knees with a shake of his head. "No use setting for the dock this time. He's gone," he said stonily. Without a change of expression whatever, Pat asserted with himself that this was indeed the case. Henry Mayer had breathed his last a few minutes since, and regardless of what his shrewd brain had made of Della Follonsbees' story, he'd never take any action now. "It was an accident, of course," Pat heard a man say loudly.
But a damn shame all the same. Mare was being so young and all.
Glancing around, he was not by all means astonished to meet Ches Denton's bold look. Once again, the cattle buyer appeared to be framing a ready alibi for somebody. I suppose you happen to know they didn't intend to get Mare. Is that it, Denton? Pat threw at him thinly.
Didn't say so, did I?
Retorted Ches. He was too wily to show temper in the face of this flat challenge.
But hell, Stevens, it stands to reason. They was only arguing amongst themselves.
Pat's nod was marked curt. Just a couple more old employees of yours, no doubt, he commented cynically. Denton would have welcomed the chance to haggle before this audience, hoping to draw forth from Pat's unmistakable hostility in an unfavorable light, but the latter, affording him no opportunity, turned on his heel and herded Salome before him as he walked out of the place.
What was the meaning of that?
Sam muttered once they were outside.
You gave Denton a pretty stiff prod. Sounded like you had something on that sneaky hombre.
Well, if what I said is true, you'll know all about it in time, growled Pat, his humorless young face set in rocky lines. He led the way down to the jail, where they met Joss Lawler, just emerging, having locked up his prisoners. Pat accosted him without preamble.
Are you charging those two with cold-blooded murder, Lawler? He demanded bluntly.
Just looked at him sharply, scratching his head in the pause which ensued.
Well, they're both yelling innocent, Stevens, he had admitted finally. Claimed it was all an accident. Nothing I've heard yet hooks 'em up with Mare in any way to prove a motive. Unless you can tell me something.
Pat did not need to be warned that any case against the guilty pair would have to be airtight. Up to the present moment, any evidence he might adduce was shadowy to say the least, and he shook a negative. It was murder, all right. He let it drop coolly. But I'll save what I have to say till I can make it stick.
Well, that's a good idea, assented Jess woodenly. Only make it fast, Stevens. I gotta get into this thing further. I'll be damn tired of all these loose shootings and killings. But the laws covering such cases may take it out of my hands in the end.
They talked a few minutes longer, and parted without Pat's having mentioned any of his suspicion concerning Ches Denton. Even Sam himself was unable to guess anything of his real thoughts.
Where to now?
He inquired. I'm going up to the hotel for a minute, said Pat. I was stopped from stepping in there last night with a gun in my ribs, so you might want to keep your eyes peeled. Sam's faded blue pupils in fact opened to their utmost in this casually delivered information, but he said no more. As it turned out, they were not molested in the slightest, mounting the hotel porch without having drawn a second glance from anyone. Just wait here, Sam. I'll be down quick. He entered the office, noted from the register which room Dell was in, and ran lightly up the stairs. A heavy-set man met him at the top, unexpectedly barring his way.
Go back,
the man ordered.
There's a sick man up here. Ain't nothing allowed to disturb him.
Pat swiftly raised a knee into his stomach and doubled him over forward before he knew what was coming. A sledging blow to the temple stretched him unconscious. Pat thoughtfully plucked the 6 gun from his holster, noted with a grunt that it was actually his own, taken from him by force the night before, and he thrust it into his waistband. A moment later, he was knocking on Dell Follonsbees' door. There was a sound of hasty movement inside, followed by silence. "Dell," he called softly. "Open up, it's me, Pat Stevens." The door swung back, and the girl faced him, startled by his grimness.
What is it, Pat? Has something happened?
You guessed it. Dell, how much did you tell Henry Mayer? Everything you guessed and knew about Pitchstone, wasn't it? Her nod was mechanical, her gaze deepeningly wondered.
You don't mean that could have touched off something already?
It has, all right. The words came clipped and unsparing. Henry Mayer was shot dead 20 minutes ago. Her start was one of cruel dismay. The blood deserted her face in a twinkling.
Oh, poor Mr. Mayer, she exclaimed. I thought he could have done so much for me, and instead look what I've done to him.
Pat scanned her tight features for any sign of breaking courage. The fact that none whatsoever had much to do with his own swift decision. This won't be left as it stands. There's still hope, he assured her, his tone almost formal. I thought you'd like to know that I'm entering the case as of 20 minutes ago. I aim to head north and look for this Vern Hunter, starting tonight. End of chapter 5.